Picture a Roman empress, majesty, dignity, marble skin and a silk toga, a symbol of power and civilization. Now throw that image into the gutter where it belongs, because the real story has a different name: the Roman empress who forced noblewomen into public sexual competitions. That's not just a title. It's a verdict on all the lies about virtue they spoon-feed you. They want you to remember the marble. We're here to show you the rot, and to introduce you to the real monsters. Forget the marble halls and the glorious legions. I want you to imagine a different Rome. Imagine the stench of a back-alley brothel in the Suburra, the kind of place where hope goes to die. The air is thick with the smell of cheap wine, stale sweat, and something far worse: fear. Now picture a noblewoman, the wife of a senator, a woman raised on poetry and privilege. She's on her knees, not in prayer. She's trembling, her fine silk dress is torn, her eyes wide with a horror you and I can barely comprehend. And standing over her, holding a lamp that casts flickering, monstrous shadows on the grimy walls, is not some brutal pimp or a drunken soldier. It's the Empress of Rome, Valeria Messalina, and she's smiling. This isn't a secret tryst. This isn't some lapse in judgment. This is a competition, a public spectacle of degradation orchestrated by the most powerful woman in the world for her own amusement. She has brought the high-born ladies of Rome to the lowest rungs of the city's filth to compete, to see who can be the most debased, to prove that her power is so absolute she can turn a matron into a whore with a snap of her fingers. This is the truth that festers beneath the gilded statues and the epic poems. The official story will tell you that Messalina, the third wife of the dribbling, imbecile Emperor Claudius, was simply a woman of appetites, a nymphomaniac, a political schemer. What a quaint, sterile lie. They sanitize the abomination to make it palatable. They want you to see a flawed individual, a political casualty. They don't want you to see the truth, that this wasn't about sex. It was never about sex. It was about the utter annihilation of the human spirit. It was about power so profound, so corrosive, that it could only be expressed through the systematic humiliation of others. She wasn't just a monster. She was the conductor of an orchestra of depravity, and all of Rome was her unwilling audience. But this disgusting act wasn't the work of one monster. It was the symptom of a disease that had infected an entire system, from the emperor's palace down to the deepest sewer. So how did they build this perfect machine of depravity? The answer is even filthier than you can imagine. So, who are the architects of this nightmare? Let's meet the jackals. First, the Empress herself, Valeria Messalina. Barely a teenager when she was shackled to the stammering, middle-aged Claudius. History, written by her enemies, paints her as a ravenous predator. And for once, the official story barely scratches the surface of the rot. Forget the political maneuvering you read about in textbooks. We're talking about a creature of pure predatory impulse, a black hole of vanity and cruelty who saw every other human being as either a tool or an obstacle. A woman who would see a beautiful necklace on another noblewoman, and instead of desiring the jewelry, would desire the ruin of the woman wearing it. Her lust wasn't for the flesh, it was for the breaking of wills. And who was the emperor, the man at the center of this web? Claudius, the stammering, limping fool the Praetorian Guard dragged out from behind a curtain and made master of the world. The historians who wanted to flatter his successors portray him as a bumbling, absent-minded academic, oblivious to his wife's transgressions. Don't you believe it? His ignorance wasn't innocence, it was complicity. He was a pathetic, terrified creature who cared only for his own comfort and his obscure historical treatises. He willingly blinded himself, creating a vacuum of power that his teenage wife and her cronies rushed to fill. He was the willing eunuch in his own court, the symbol of the utter impotence at the heart of the empire. But a queen needs her court. Messalina didn't operate alone. Her power was amplified by a cabal of ex-slaves, The imperial freedmen, men like Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus. These were the true rulers of Rome. Slaves who had tasted the whip now wielded it with a vengeance. They were the ones who whispered in Claudius's ear, who controlled access to the throne, who ran the bureaucracy of the state. They saw in Messalina a perfect instrument. They fed her paranoia, facilitated her purges, and laundered her blood money, all while getting obscenely rich and powerful themselves. They were the slithering parasites that clung to the rotten carcass of Roman power, whispering poison and counting their gold. But a few jackals acting in the shadows is one thing. What happens when they turn their personal sickness into the law of the land? What happens when the entire mechanism of power exists only to feed their perverse desires? That's where the real nightmare begins. How did they get away with it? They built a machine, a perfect, self-sustaining engine of filth. It wasn't chaos, it was a system, elegant in its brutality, and it ran on three fuels: greed, fear, and law. First, the law. In the hands of Messalina and her cabal, Roman law, the supposed bedrock of civilization, became a butcher's knife. Did Messalina desire the magnificent gardens of Lucullus, owned by the patrician Valerius Asiaticus? She didn't need an army. She needed a witness. She and her cronies manufactured a charge of treason. They bribed informants, tortured slaves for false testimony, and presented the evidence to the terrified, spineless Senate. Asiaticus was forced to kill himself. His gardens became hers. His family was destroyed. This was their blueprint. Over and over, they used the courts not for justice, but for extortion, accusation, trial, execution, seizure of property. A neat, legal, and utterly monstrous assembly line of destruction. Next, fear. The Roman elite, the senators, the equestrians, they weren't stupid. They saw what was happening. So why did they sit there, silent, as their peers were dragged off one by one? Because they were cowards. They watched their friends and rivals get devoured, and they just prayed the monster wasn't hungry for them today. Silence was survival. To speak out was to have your name added to the list. Messalina cultivated this terror. She would invite a senator to a lavish dinner party one night, showering him with favor, only to have him arrested at dawn. This psychological warfare shattered any possibility of organized resistance. They were all trapped in the same cage, too scared to even look at each other, let alone fight back. Finally, greed. This wasn't just about satisfying Messalina's whims. It was a business. The positions of power in the Roman state, governorships, military commands, even citizenship itself, were all for sale. Messalina and her freedmen ran the empire like a mob protection racket. Want to become a senator? That will be 1,000,000 sesterces. Need a favorable ruling in court? The price can be arranged. They bled the empire dry, funneling its wealth into their own coffers. This corruption wasn't a byproduct of the system, it was the system. And it implicated everyone. The men who bought their positions were now part of the rot, complicit in the crimes that funded their ambition. They had built a perfect, self-sustaining engine of filth. But every machine, when pushed to its absolute limit, either breaks down or explodes. And an explosion was coming. An event so vile, so brazenly contemptuous of all reality, it would make everything before it look like child's play. This was the day the mask finally came off. This was the moment the sickness ceased to be a conspiracy in the shadows and became a roaring fire in the town square. In the year 48 AD, while the Emperor Claudius was away from Rome, visiting the port of Ostia, his Empress Valeria Messalina decided to get married. Let that sink in. The wife of the living emperor held a public wedding ceremony with a full dowry and witnesses to her lover, the handsome and ambitious Senator Gaius Silius. This wasn't just adultery. This was an act of such staggering, contemptuous arrogance that it bordered on madness. It was a declaration of war on the entire Roman state, on tradition, on sanity itself. Silius, for his part, was no innocent victim. He was a fool blinded by ambition, convinced that with Messalina he could usurp the throne from the pathetic old man in Ostia. Imagine the scene: a lavish wedding feast, a drunken, debauched bacchanal held in the heart of Rome. The sources tell us that Messalina, dressed as a bride, fell into the arms of her new husband in front of a crowd of cheering, terrified guests. They were celebrating the symbolic death of their own emperor. They were toasting their own enslavement. This was the ultimate act of humiliation. She wasn't just cuckolding her husband. She was cuckolding the entire Roman Empire. She was forcing the elite to participate in her treason, to become accomplices in their own subjugation. Any who refused to attend would be marked as an enemy. Any who attended were stained by her crime. This was the point of no return. It was no longer about secret murders or backroom deals. This was a public proclamation that she was the state, that she was above law, above tradition, above the gods themselves. It was an act of pure nihilistic power. She had torn down the final veil of propriety and revealed the snarling, monstrous face of her regime. She had dared the world to stop her. They had crossed the line. The pact with the devil was signed in blood and wine. But all of this grand political theater of treason, was just a rehearsal for her final masterpiece of cruelty. What they did next wasn't just a crime. It was an abomination against humanity itself. Forget the wedding. Forget the politics. We are now in the cesspit at the heart of the labyrinth. Pliny the Elder and the satirist Juvenal, men who wrote within living memory of these events, give us the final, disgusting scene. They tell a story that the official histories, in their shame, barely dare to whisper. Messalina, the Empress, Augusta, wife of the Pontifex Maximus, descendant of gods, slipped out of the palace at night. She put on a blonde wig, concealed her identity, and went to a common brothel. There, under the name Lysiska, the she-wolf, she entered a contest. Her opponent was Scylla, the most famous, most tireless prostitute in all of Rome. The prize? There was no prize, only the victory itself. The goal was to see who could take more lovers in a single 24-hour period, to see who could endure the most, to see who was the most debased. But here is the truth the official story scrubs away. The part that elevates this from a sordid anecdote into a true vision of hell. She didn't go alone. She brought other noblewomen with her, wives and daughters of the very senators who trembled before her. Can you even begin to fathom the psychological terror? Imagine being dragged from your gilded home, taken to the foulest corner of the city, and forced to participate in this imperial game of degradation. Forced to sell your body alongside common prostitutes, not for money, not for survival, but for the viewing pleasure of the monster who held your family's life in her hands. Juvenal describes the scene with visceral disgust. He writes of her, the Empress, with womb still burning, continuing long after her opponent had given up, finally leaving at dawn, weary but not yet satisfied, taking with her the stench of the brothel back to the imperial pillow. This wasn't about lust. It was the ultimate expression of her power. It was a ritualistic act of defilement. By forcing those women into the filth with her, she was proving that there was no such thing as nobility, no honor, no virtue that she could not corrupt and destroy. She was dragging the entire Roman aristocracy, the very concept of Roman dignity, through the muck and proving that it was all a lie. She was showing them that, under her rule, everyone was a whore. And when the carnage was over, a terrible silence fell. The women were sent back to their homes, broken. The city pretended it hadn't happened. But in that silence, a new horror was born. The lie. The desperate, pathetic attempt to bury the bodies and rewrite the story. But you cannot bury the truth. And the truth that crawled out of that mass grave was even more monstrous than the massacre itself. Every monster fears the dawn, and the dawn was coming for them. The wedding to Silius was too much. Not for the Senate, not for the people of Rome. They were too beaten down to matter. It was too much for the other jackals in the palace. The freedman Narcissus, seeing Messalina and Silius planning to eliminate him next, finally realized the rabid dog he'd been feeding was about to turn on him. He scurried to Ostia and, in a fit of manufactured panic, finally told the emperor what was happening. And how did the master of the world, the divine Claudius, react? With righteous fury? With a call for justice? No. He reacted with pathetic, blubbering terror. He kept asking his guards over and over, "Am I still emperor?" He had to be coaxed and prodded into action by Narcissus, who effectively seized control of the state for a few crucial hours. There was no grand trial, no public reckoning for Messalina's countless victims. There was just a squalid palace coup. Messalina's end was as pathetic as her life was grotesque. Her allies and lovers abandoned her in an instant. She was hunted down in the gardens of Lucullus, the very park she had murdered a man to possess. She tried to write letters to Claudius, tried to appeal to their children, but Narcissus made sure no message would reach the wavering, sentimental old fool. A tribune was sent to execute her. She tried to kill herself, but the coward lacked the nerve. The soldier ran her through with his sword, and that was it. Justice. Don't make me laugh. This wasn't justice. This was pest control. One set of parasites eliminating another. The system didn't punish her for her evil. It punished her for her sloppiness. She threatened the stability of the other monsters, and so she had to be put down. The sycophantic Senate immediately decreed a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. Her name was chiseled off monuments, her statues torn down. They tried to pretend she never existed. The great Roman lie machine, burying another one of its crimes. In the end, their empire of filth crumbled. But their legacy? Their legacy is a poison that still seeps into the ground we walk on today. They taught the world a lesson, not about justice, but about how much evil humanity will tolerate and even celebrate in the name of power. History remembers Messalina as a sexual deviant, a simple caricature. They've neatly filed away the horror, but her true crime wasn't her lust. It was her discovery of a terrible truth, that civilization is a thin, fragile veneer, and that with enough power and enough fear, you can make anyone, absolutely anyone, kneel in the filth. And if you think their time is over, if you think we've learned anything at all, you haven't been paying attention.